A lot of times in our journey with God and our relationship with God, I think this is a lot of the reason why God uses human beings to do his work on earth. He wants us and he desires for us to step out in faith. We know what God is concerned with, right? The will of God is our sanctification. God is concerned with growing each one of us individually. And one of the biggest ways that that happens is when we are stepping out in faith before we know what God is going to do, before we know the results of what God is going to do.
This is Breaking Barriers, where we help pastors and churches grow so that they can go.
Hey guys, welcome to this week's episode of Breaking Barriers. Man, we are a ministry that is all about growing and going. We believe churches can grow without going, but they can't go without growing. This week's a cool episode. We're going to pick right back up in a conversation that Pastor Bobby and I had that we started on the podcast last week. It was concerning our 1-year anniversary, and man, we just got at a 30,000 foot view, and we just said, hey, let's talk all things about breaking barriers. About the origins, about some of the pragmatic things that we've tackled, some stories that we've heard, just the whole deal. If you're trying to get an accurate picture of what Breaking Barriers is all about, stay tuned and jump back into this conversation from last week. Well, man, let's talk about for Breaking Barriers. Okay, year in, we've been obviously at this coaching people and stuff a lot longer than that, but for the podcast's sake and some of our conferences and our one-day events have been last year and a half, whatever. Man, what are some of the big, if somebody's new, and this is like, man, they've just gotten turned on to this idea, they're trying to get freed up from anti-church growth, the chains are, the scales are falling off their eyes, okay? What are some of the things, you put it really well, we try to reframe some stuff, and I just think a few things that we really try hard to reframe. I think it'd be good to tick through 3 or 4 of them and just talk about it here for a minute. The first one, if I'll talk about it, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, but I'll just kind of kick it off. The first one is, one of the things that I think that we have tried to help guys do is get freed up to lean into who they are. And, that's the whole church as a brand discussion. Now I think what people think is that we're looking at growing as a brand. And it's actually like, no, that's not what we're saying. Well, because what we're saying is, beyond the growth stuff and the going stuff, like we have a brand. Every church has a brand. What we've tried to say, I don't know if we've done it well. What we've tried to say is, there are many brands that fit who guys are, but within that brand, you still, maybe you could do your prepared jar stuff here in just a minute, but we still have an opportunity to try to ask God to do things within the framework of how he's created us, with what we want, with how we want our church to be. I've heard everybody from Tony Marita to Larry Osborne say, hey man, plant the church you want to go to. That's kind of what we're saying. Like, hey, your church is going to have a brand, lean into that. It's going to probably come out of who you are and who your leaders are, whether you're a long-standing pastor or you're planting a church or whatever it is. But use all that in a way that tries to aim at adding people to your church, and so you can send them out. Some of the popular church brands that I've kind of talked about, I think Small Town Rural is sort of a brand. I think that programmatic. I think, we talked about 9 Marks as kind of a brand. We're sort of big box sending. So it's kind of like, man, we're sort of a big box, but also like with a real bent on sending people out. I think Diversity Church can sort of be a brand. Guys really lean the Mosaics of the world. It's like, man, they are, and what you find is you end up attracting people that love that. And what's cool about the brands, this is, I was got in a huge argument with Greer a couple of weeks ago. And it's funny because, I think everybody listening to us, the feedback I got was, man, I feel like you guys are just kind of saying the same thing from a different angle. And I think kind of what we're saying is, like, every one of these brands, they lean into something that sits within the framework of some gospel tensions, And that basically, the ultimate gospel tension is ecclesiology on one side, missiology on the other. What is the church supposed to be? Depth. How wide is it supposed to go in mission? Wide, And we're all sitting on different, parts on that journey, or parts on that continuum. And the different brands sort of end up showing something about what God is doing or about what the church is supposed to express, but they emphasize something a little bit differently. 9 Marks is going to emphasize something differently than you and I do in more of a big box model. the diversity church is going to emphasize some good things about gospel unity in a way that maybe the small town rural church doesn't. They sort of believe some of the same things, and they're on the same continuum, but they're expressing things in a little bit of a different. And what we say is, instead of fighting against that, lean into that, right? Like lean into it, express that uniqueness in terms of the church, but try to do it in a way that grows and goes.
Yeah, I mean, another way to kind of say it is you came up with the kind of framework of like every church is a brand. I mean, another way to say it would just be like every church has a culture. Yeah. And all those cultures don't have to be the same. And a lot of times it is based on, how the leaders of the church are wired. I don't know anybody listening, if you've ever taken like the APES test, it's apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher. And it's just a little bit of a framework to just kind of say how you're wired. It's not to say you're like an actual apostle now, but all pastors are wired differently, right? Mm-hmm. You have guys that are more apostolic, and that's kind of how I'm wired. It's like, man, you want to be in more frontier stuff. You want to be doing new stuff. You want to be launching stuff, starting stuff. You have guys, and you're like this, and you're preaching that can be very prophetic. Guys that really want to just kind of speak in a prophetic way. You have guys that are naturally really evangelistic, and it's like, man, they're just wired in a certain way, and they draw people in a certain way. You have guys that are very shepherding oriented, and it's like, yeah, we all need to be shepherds, but some of us are more shepherding oriented, right? And it would be like saying, man, we need Peter to plant the same church that Paul is going to plant. And It's like, that's crazy, because like clearly Paul was more apostolically wired, right? And it's like, I'm sure people could critique him, man. Every 1 year you're on to a new place and you're on to the next place. Why can't you just stay somewhere? Right. And I'm sure his churches and things he were involved with had different vibes than other guys. And that's what you're saying. It's like, man, just accept that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what we've tried to get across is like, hey man, you're probably going to do the best if you plant the church you want to go to. And man, you kind of lean into that and lean into sort of who you are. You mentioned Acts 2 earlier. I don't know if we need to go back through that, but another big part of what we talk about, if you're just ticking down the list of some of the bigger breaking barriers ideas, is the theology of the crowd. Mm-hmm. Man, that is just the biggest thing that we try to talk about is like, hey, if you want to see one missionary go out, you need to see 100 first-time guests come through the door. And most of them are going to come because a friend invited them. And it's awesome when you hear of a story. Like I just heard of a story of one of our college students sharing the gospel with somebody on campus and the person got saved. I rejoice over that. But I don't rejoice over it more than the college student who simply is just like a faithful attender and in a group and they invite somebody to come and that person gets saved, Right. So, I mean, God is just doing stuff all over, but the theology of the crowd. Another one that we talk about is that I think this is probably one of the more viral things of whatever viral is for breaking barriers, but would be preparing the jars. And Bobby, this is really we've all preached the message, but it originates from you. Well, it originates from the Bible, but you're the one who kind of really used this language. And I think this is one of the things we've tried to do is say, guys, having courage to take steps is not the same as a prideful presumption on God. Like what the outcome is going to be. Those are two different things, but we want to be courageous. Talk about preparing the jars.
Yeah, I mean, at the very heart of preparing the jars, it's a biblical thing to say, man, a lot of times in our journey with God and our relationship with God, I think this is a lot of the reason why God uses human beings to do his work on earth is he wants us and he desires for us to step out in faith. And because we know what God is concerned with, right? The will of God is our sanctification. God is concerned with growing each one of us individually. And one of the biggest ways that happens is when we are stepping out in faith before we know what God is going to do, before we know the results of what God is going to do. I mean, you could find 10 frameworks for this in the Old Testament, all the way from, Abraham having to sacrifice his son or being willing to sacrifice his son, all the way until, the people going across the Jordan, the people walking around Jericho, all these different stories of, God could just do it, right? God could just do whatever he wants, but God's like, hey, you're going to do this first. You're going to step out in faith in this way first. And what we have seen is you have a lot of guys that have stuff in their heart and stuff in their minds that are really limiting what they're willing to step out and do. Mm-hmm. because they kind of expect it to be the opposite. They kind of expect it more like the disciples, in the house praying before the Holy Spirit comes, like this idea, like, man, we're just going to wait on God until God moves. Most of the time in the Bible, though, it's like, man, we have to step out in faith before God moves because God wants us to do that. 2 Kings 4 is where the language of preparing the jars comes from. We have just tried to help a lot of guys because we have had to walk this journey week in, week out ourselves as Mercy Hill has grown, right? Because as soon as the church grows, when you look back, all those things that were scary aren't scary anymore because they're known to you, right? Like you've gotten past those scary things of we didn't have enough space or we didn't have enough money or there was this division in the church or whatever. The things in the past aren't scary anymore because they're known. Well, the things in the future are now very scary because you have to step out again in faith and say, God, we're going to prepare the jars. We're going to trust that you're going to work. We're going to trust that you're going to move. And we're going to try to lead in that way. And so that's something that we've tried to help a lot of, church leaders with is just that idea of, man, like you've never arrived, like on this leadership pastoral journey. Every single year, like, yeah, you don't know what God's going to do.
Right.
But you need to be stepping out in faith, presuming that he is going to work in your church.
Yeah.
And you need to be leading people in that way because God, as you a leader, he calls you not to have fear and he calls you to have courage. And we're trying to help guys with that. And it's crazy. So many guys, and we've done it too. Like you don't realize it, but you're trying to hedge your bets all the time when you're leading. Mm-hmm. You're trying to always hedge your bets. And when you're freed up from that sometimes, yeah, man, sometimes it's going to go wrong, but sometimes God's going to show up in a way that you just could have never imagined. And that's a big part of just the idea of, man, breaking barriers. A lot of those barriers are just in our own hearts, in our own minds. Yeah. God can never move that way here in this city. God can never do that through me. I'm not a good enough pastor, whatever it may be.
Right. Yeah. I mean, one of the ways that I think we've said it is like we get a chance to control what we're praying and asking God to do. So I don't know if he's going to do it, but man, we get a chance to sort of pray, ask, and then mix that with our faith, which is, putting the jars out in terms of just organizing things and being ready for what he's going to do. Another thing that I think is kind of a hallmark of breaking barriers is this idea of being pragmatic to the max and just like owning that. We've already said this, but I think there's a lot of another breaking barrier, another freedom comes when churches just realize, hey man, we are all pragmatists. I mean, if we decide to do Vacation Bible School this summer, there's not a verse in the Bible that told us to do that. If we decide to do a sports camp, there's no verse that told us to do that. It's like we are all after, hopefully, we're after the same stuff. Man, seeing people come to Christ, mobilizing them through discipleship and getting them going on mission. And there's a lot of different ways we can do that. And there's a lot of different organizational things that need to happen in the church to do that. Any church that has a website that has organized as a 501c3 for tax status, I mean, these are all pragmatic decisions. Right. They're not theological decisions. And so instead of saying, oh, we just don't want to be pragmatic, what we need to say is, I like what Howerton said, Bible and brain. I mean, when there's clear Bible around it, you just do that.
Right.
And when there's not, then you're free to like, man, don't sin, but you're free to kind of get after it. And so we've talked some about that.
Yeah, it's like, what does the pastor wear to preach in every Sunday? Mm-hmm. It's like, well, the Bible don't really tell us.
Right.
People have made lots of issues around that. You remember like 30 years ago, it was like all these guys that were basically saying you were almost in sin if you weren't preaching in like a suit and tie. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, Jesus wasn't wearing no suit and tie. Yeah. He's probably wearing a robe or whatever, But that's the idea of like, oh, okay, they're wearing a suit and tie for pragmatism, obviously, because that was what's going to be accepted or whatever, Mm-hmm. But they just put this huge theological bent on it. Like,
they would end up
wouldn't show up meeting the president, wearing that shirt, you'd have a suit.
Actually, I probably would, but yeah, I know what you mean though. Well, hey, last one. I mean, there's a lot of things. We've done a whole year's worth of podcasts, but I'm just trying to boil some of these things in big buckets. I think another big bucket for us is that discipleship is more than one-on-one mentorship. And we've tried really hard to say, man, discipleship is anything that's moving people towards a more Christ-like, image for their life, like behavior and their heart and all of that. I do think in our culture right now, people have hijacked the word discipleship. they've just and they've divorced it from the concept of church growth. I remember, I'll just never forget a couple different situations where I was in. It's always a missiologist too. It's like they're not a pastor. They have never like grown something. It's just like their thing is like, talking to pastors about what they're supposed to do, But anyway,
Love that.
it was like, hey, I don't want to give my life over. The guy said, I don't want to give my life over to helping mega churches get bigger. I want to make disciples who make disciples. And it just sounds so smooth. Like, it's like, man, that's the perfect conference language. And then you're like, wait a minute, I'm the mega church. Like what are we trying to do? I mean, that's exactly what we're trying to do, is make disciples. Like, you kind of just divorce this idea of, if you're really making disciples, it can't happen in a big growing church or even a small growing church. I remember I was at another thing like this in the North American Mission Board. And again, same profile, different guy, not a pastor, hadn't grown anything. He was, and he just said, man, I'm so tired of the church getting in the way of disciple making. I was like, man, if you took the churches out of Greensboro right now, this place would be hell in 1 minute.
Right.
That's what it would be. It'd be hell on earth. I mean, it's so funny too. These guys have all been discipled in churches who didn't know how to make disciples. So it's just kind of mind blowing. What we've tried to do is say, hey, are they pointing some stuff out that's good? Yeah, they're pointing some stuff out. Like, man, you need more personal touch. You can't disciple someone solely from the pulpit. I mean, I get that. But I do think that it's pushed us to think about, guys, let's go to Acts 2. Let's hear the apostles' teaching. Let's get together in groups. Let's break bread from house to house and let the Spirit work. And so, yeah, we've kind of gone to gather groups, give, go, but just the idea of discipleship being word taught, life caught. The primary lever for that is preaching. Mm-hmm. And we say, preaching is going to be the most evangelistic and discipleship-oriented hour of the whole week. And so we know that you're teaching people God's word. Doesn't mean they don't need to be in the lab. It doesn't mean they don't need mission trips. It doesn't mean they don't need one-on-one, things if that's what your church does. But preaching is a huge component of the discipleship model. Yeah. We're not going to demonize that or say it's not.
Yeah, I would say too, it's just another way to say exactly what you're saying is, I think we believe that like discipleship and teaching and the church in general, it's all meant to be scaled, and there's nothing wrong with that, because like kind of in the anti-church growth movement, it's like as soon as you move beyond one-on-one or 1 to 3, there starts being this real negative kind of assumption that something is wrong, and we just don't see it that way, I mean, you think about like the Bible, the very fact of writing the Bible is like the most scaled thing that you could do to get Christianity out, right? And, Paul will do that. Like, man, I'm going to write this letter to this church. It's not one-on-one. It's going to be in a very scaled way. That's what preaching is. I mean, they were dealing with these issues in Acts 6, like, man, you got all these people with need. Like, how do we scale this thing in a different way? And it's like, there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
Like, man, if God blesses it, then we should be thinking about like, man, how can we scale this thing in a healthy way? But a lot of times it's just like, man, if it's growing and you can't do the one-on-one anymore, that you got to do the 1 to 10 or 1 to 20 or 1 to 100, like, man, you're doing something wrong. And it's just like, no, that's just...
I was, to your point, I mean, I made that point about like the way that Paul writes letters and how they were using the early church. And the guy's like, nah, he wrote a letter to Timothy and that's one-on-one. I'm like, dude, that letter has been read by 100 million people, right? Hundreds of million, even the very idea of it going to Timothy, at some point, you realize like, man, this thing is for the circulation among the church body.
Of course.
I mean, yeah, I'm not saying Paul didn't have a good one-on-one relationship with Timothy. We all should have that. I mean, have your Paul, have your Timothy. I get that. But the teaching of God's word is like being cast. I mean, I do think that's what we see Paul doing as he's writing and telling them to read the letters to each other and stuff like that. So, man, let's finish like this. Hey, so let's just each pick like one, man. What is like a really incredible story that has come out of the last year, where guys are, they're just getting freed up and they're starting to grow. I mean, I hear this stuff all the time. I get text messages all the time. People are like, man, we're just eating it up. And the numbers bear that out in terms of just views and stuff. So I think the message is getting out. What, you want to start any kind of story come to your mind?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of these types of stories where, man, we start thinking about things a little bit better. We put more thought into this thing that we're doing, and then God blesses it in a really unique way. I think about this recent cohort that we did. So we have we do the podcast. That's probably the widest thing. We do one-day events where maybe 50 or 60 church leaders will come to it. We do our conference. We also have a cohort where there may be 5 or 6 churches that we're walking alongside of them for a year or so, and we're going over some really specific stuff that we share on the podcast, but we go way deeper on like, hey, let's work with you around these topics. And probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 months ago, we did one with the cohort where we were talking about, it was kind of like preparing the jars mixed with the importance of engaging people around giving and money and how important that is for discipleship. So it was those things paired together, and it was talking about, there was a bit of a pragmatic part, which was, hey, you need to be really good at this stuff at the end of the year, right? Because we live in the United States, there's tax write-offs, people think about giving at the end of the year. It's very, it's funny. Right. The anti-pragmatist church still do giving initiatives at the end of the year. They just don't realize they're pragmatists. So we were trying to just help these guys, step out in faith and maybe go for stuff they've never gone before, and also to try to provide some systems and frameworks for them. And the results that a lot of them got were just like wild. Man, we had never broken X amount in a December. And man, we went through this and we prayed about it and we were scared and we stepped out in faith, but we had these brothers around us. And so we kind of had the courage to step forward. And then, they had twice as much giving come in the month of December. Right. Just stuff like that. That's immeasurable kingdom impact on the people, in their church that are stepping out and giving for the first time, but also where the money is actually going, so.
Man, that's awesome. Yeah, I remember being in that cohort. Man, my story I would pick out is just, I've actually told this one before, but it resonates with me deeply because of my background growing up in a small, at that time, decently rural Baptist church, Southern Baptist church. But we had a brother that's been connected to Breaking Barriers stuff, and he is in a small 100-year-old whatever church, kind of on the eastern part of North Carolina, rural community. Actually, we're finding a lot of guys like that are listening to this stuff. Mm-hmm. I think you might think it's just kind of bigger churches or whatever. It's really not, because all these principles are transferable. And anyway, their church is out of room. They need to go to 2 services. Not a huge church, maybe 100 people in the auditorium or whatever it is. And he said, hey, we need to go to 2 services. Pragmatic deal. Right. It's not, you don't have to do that. I mean, there's other ways to skin the cat, but the easiest thing that we preach is like for leadership development and to make sure everybody's starting to get an opportunity to participate in worship. And,
right.
You don't have the same 5 women sitting back there with the kids every single week. And just for all the reasons, we love 2 services. Well, his deacon board were like, man, we don't want to do that. They stopped it. Mm-hmm. And we're like, man, that's going to be too much, or it's going to be this, or it's going to be that. And he actually had them go listen to the 2 episodes that we did on why, the heart behind and the how of 2 services.
Right.
And after they listened to him, they came back to him and said, man, we should do it. Let's do it. And so they did it. And by all accounts, it's gone really well. So I just was really encouraged by that, just because I've been in church just like that. So, well, hey guys, we're going to wrap it up there. Just so you know, if this is your first time listening to us, you're interested in these things, there's a few ways to connect. The easiest way is to join our private Facebook group. You can find that at breakinggrowthbarriers.com, and then you'll get on the Facebook group from there. Second way is, obviously, you're doing that right now. You're listening to our podcast. Third way is we have a series of events every year. Each quarter, we do a quarterly one day, we call it. Man, we just tackle something that's very much in this pragmatic growth lane. It helps people a lot. We want you to come, man, connect with us, get some coaching. It's pretty cool. And then every year we have a conference in the fall, and we'll be doing that again this upcoming fall. So hope you guys will be able to jump in on that. All right, that's it.